On the night of August the 8th, 2026, on a stretch of Black Sea coastline near the resort town of Gelendzhik, a Russian S-400 missile position was burning. Not for a few seconds, not for a passing flash caught on a grainy phone video, for 3 hours. That detail comes directly from the man in charge of the drones that hit it, Robert Brovdi, callsign Madyar, commander of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, who wrote on Telegram that the S-400 position in Gelendzhik was ablaze and sputtering for 3 hours. Hours earlier, that same system had fired 6 missiles into Ukraine. By the next morning, it was a smoking wreck on Russian soil. That is the story we're going to walk through today, not as a single headline, but as the latest strike in a much longer campaign that has been quietly reshaping the war in the skies over Russia and Ukraine for more than a year. Before we go further, it's worth being precise about what the S-400 actually is, because the phrase most dangerous defense system gets thrown around a lot in coverage of this war. And in this case, it happens to be accurate rather than exaggerated. The S-400 Triumph, known to NATO by the reporting name SA-21 Growler, is Russia's most advanced operational long-range air defense system. It was developed by the Almaz-Antey Design Bureau, entered Russian service in 2007, and grew directly out of the Soviet-era S-300 family, which was already considered one of the most feared air defense networks of the late Cold War. The S-400 pushed that lineage further. Its most capable missiles can reach out to roughly 400 kilometers. Its radar systems, depending on the configuration, can track targets at ranges approaching 600 kilometers, and a single battery can theoretically engage dozens of targets at once: aircraft, cruise missiles, drones, and even tactical ballistic missiles. It is mobile, built onto heavy transporter erector launchers, and Russian doctrine calls for a battery to be capable of relocating within roughly 5 minutes, specifically to survive the kind of preemptive strike that just happened near Gelendzhik. This is not a system Russia hands out casually. It is the backbone of Russian strategic air defense, and it is also one of Russia's most successful defense exports, sold to Turkey, China, and India, in deals that have shaped diplomatic relationships far beyond this war. When a system like that gets destroyed, it is not a minor tactical footnote. It is a dent in the umbrella that is supposed to protect Russian territory and Russian forces from exactly the kind of long-range Ukrainian strikes that have become increasingly routine. So let's go back to Gelendzhik and lay out exactly what is confirmed, because in a story like this, precision matters more than drama. According to Madyar's own statement, the S-400 launch pad near Gelendzhik had fired 6 missiles on the morning of August 8th. That detail is significant on its own because it points to something analysts have been flagging for months. Russia is increasingly repurposing systems that were designed for defense into offensive weapons. As missile expert Fabian Hoffman has written, these repurposed interceptors are less accurate and less lethal than Russia's dedicated strike missiles, but they still represent a real threat to civilian infrastructure, particularly when fired at densely populated areas. In other words, this was not a defensive battery sitting quietly in reserve. It had just been used to launch an attack. Hours later, Ukrainian drones found it and hit it, and by Madyar's account, it burned for 3 hours before the fire went out. That is the anchor fact of this story, reported by the Kyiv Independent on August 9th, and it did not happen in isolation. In that same Telegram statement, Madyar said his drone units had also recently destroyed several other air defense systems in Russia's Krasnodar Krai and in the neighboring Rostov region, along with 2 radar stations in Rostov. That is important context, because it tells you Gelendzhik was not a lone lucky strike. It was one node in an active, ongoing campaign against Russian air defense infrastructure across the entire southern stretch of Russian territory bordering the Black Sea and the war zone. And that campaign, when you zoom out, has a much longer history than a single week in August. To understand how unusual this moment is, you have to go back through 2026 and look at the pattern building underneath it. According to a database compiled and analyzed by the outlet Tochny and reported by the Kyiv Independent, researchers tracked more than 1,130 verified attacks across Russia and occupied Ukraine, and within that dataset identified over 492 confirmed strikes specifically on Russian air defense infrastructure between June of 2025 and early March of 2026. Hundreds more strikes in that same window targeted the wider network of systems that support air defense. Electronic warfare units, command posts, and missile assets that together form what military analysts call an anti-access area denial network, or A2AD for short. The data shows something specific and deliberate. Ukraine has been targeting every layer of Russia's air defense architecture, with radar systems taking the largest share of confirmed hits, followed by medium and long-range air defense assets like the S-400 and S-300 families. This is not random opportunism. It is a strategy aimed at prying open gaps in Russian airspace so that longer-range Ukrainian drones and missiles can slip through those gaps and reach targets deeper inside Russian territory. Military logistics hubs, oil infrastructure, And now, as we will get to, naval assets that Russia thought were safely out of reach. Separately, Ukraine's own Unmanned Systems Forces reported that in just the first 5 months of 2026, their drone units struck 174 confirmed Russian air defense targets, including surface-to-air missile systems, radar stations, and electronic warfare equipment, with an estimated combined value exceeding $4 billion. The Unmanned Systems Forces themselves were careful to note that the financial cost is not really the point. What matters more is what each destroyed system represents. One less set of eyes watching Russian airspace, one less set of missiles ready to intercept an incoming Ukrainian drone or cruise missile, and by extension, one more opening for the next Ukrainian strike to get through cleanly. An independent count from open-source intelligence analyst Clément Mollin, cited by United 24 Media, put the number of successful strikes on Russian air defense systems at 44 in just the first few months of 2026 alone. Individually tracked incidents from that period read like a slow demolition of Russia's layered shield. In late March, a Ukrainian strike disabled a Russian S-400 Triumph mobile launcher, a system capable of engaging close to 100 targets simultaneously, in the Tula region, deep inside Russia and nowhere near the front line. Just days before that, a Buk M3 system in the Bryansk region was hit and put out of action. Back in January, a 9S-32M1 radar, which forms part of the S-300V system, was destroyed, with video evidence backing up the claim. And a Panzer S-1 short-range air defense system was neutralized by a drone strike near the village of Nove, close to occupied Melitopol. None of these were isolated incidents. They were part of the same rolling campaign that, 7 months later, would reach the S-400 position at Gelendzhik. Tomasz Nagy, an air defense analyst at the security research organization Globsec, offered a framing for why this matters strategically rather than just tactically. He explained that while any single destroyed system might look minor set against the sheer size of Russia's overall military arsenal, the accumulation of enough tactical successes eventually becomes highly relevant at the operational level. No single strike wins a war. But when you methodically stack dozens, then hundreds of these strikes on top of each other, month after month, you start to open what analysts describe as corridors, gaps in radar coverage and missile defense density that Ukraine's longer-range strike systems can then exploit to reach targets that would otherwise be completely protected. Ukraine's own general staff has been transparent about this being a deliberate priority rather than a side effect of the war. According to a statement from the Armed Forces of Ukraine, throughout April of 2026 alone, Ukrainian forces struck at least 25 major enemy air defense and radar systems, with radar installations making up the largest share, roughly 12 confirmed systems hit in that month. These operations were described as targeting Russian logistics, depots, command nodes, and air defense systems together as part of what Ukraine's military calls middle strike operations, strikes aimed at targets positioned between the front line and Russia's deep strategic rear. Following a meeting with Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov, President Volodymyr Zelensky reportedly emphasized that this middle strike approach is one of Ukraine's key military priorities for the months ahead. Not a temporary tactic, but a sustained pillar of strategy. It's also worth understanding how this specific campaign is organized on the Ukrainian side, because it isn't just scattered volunteer drone crews improvising. According to reporting from United 24 Media, a series of overnight strikes on Russian positions in occupied Crimea and the occupied part of Donetsk region back in early June, hitting air defense systems, radar installations, command infrastructure, and drone-related facilities, was carried out under something called the Deep Strike Center, a dedicated command structure stood up specifically to coordinate this kind of long-range targeting. Among the reported targets in that operation was a Pantsir S-1 system located near the village of Vidin in occupied Crimea. The existence of a purpose-built command center for this mission tells you something important. This is not opportunistic drone warfare. It is a structured, resourced military program with its own chain of command, built specifically around the job of finding and destroying Russian air defense assets, wherever they happen to be sitting, whether that's occupied Ukrainian territory or deep inside Russia itself. It's also worth putting the S-400 itself in a slightly wider historical frame, because this war is not the system's first real test, and the results elsewhere have been mixed in ways that are relevant here. According to reporting from the outlet The Defense Post, the S-400 has never been tested in a full-scale war against a peer military adversary with comparable technology, and much of what's publicly claimed about its performance against stealth aircraft and advanced missile threats is difficult to independently verify, given how little transparent combat data Russia has released over the years. Russia has deployed S-400 batteries to protect major military bases, strategic regions, and critical infrastructure, including deployments around Syria, the Arctic, and the Black Sea. But that same reporting notes that the war in Ukraine has actually provided the most significant real-world test of the S-400 to date, And the outcome, in the defense post's own assessment, has been mixed. Russian S-400 batteries deployed to protect Crimea, frontline zones, and other strategic assets have not consistently prevented Ukrainian drone and cruise missile attacks from reaching their targets, even though most of those Ukrainian attacks involve comparatively low-end weapons, rather than sophisticated Western-supplied systems. That's an important qualifier. Gelendzhik wasn't defeated by an advanced Western missile. It was destroyed, according to Madyar's own account, by drones, the same relatively low-cost, mass-produced weapon category that has been chipping away at this supposedly elite system for more than a year now. Russia has already announced what it calls the S-400's eventual successor, a system called the S-500 Prometei, which Russian officials claim will be able to engage satellites, hypersonic weapons, and intercontinental ballistic missile warheads. That system remains in limited testing and is not yet widely deployed. So for now, the S-400 remains the most advanced air defense system Russia actually has operating at scale, which is exactly why losing individual batteries of it, even one at a time, carries real weight. There's a naval history dimension to the Novorossiysk story that's worth spelling out too, because it explains why Zelensky's last stronghold framing isn't just rhetorical flourish. For most of the early years of this war, the Russian Black Sea Fleet's primary home was Sevastopol on the occupied Crimean Peninsula, a base Russia had held in one form or another since the Soviet era, and one it treated as essentially untouchable. That assumption broke down over time. Repeated Ukrainian missile strikes and notably waves of Ukrainian naval drone attacks, a genuinely new category of weapon that this war effectively pioneered, made Sevastopol increasingly unsafe for Russia's larger surface ships. Over the following 2 years, Russia progressively relocated much of its Black Sea fleet roughly 300 kilometers east, away from the range of many Ukrainian systems at the time, to Novorossiysk, inside Russia's own internationally recognized territory in Krasnodar Krai. The logic was straightforward. Novorossiysk was farther from Ukrainian-controlled coastline, better defended, and simply harder to reach. The August 12th strike matters specifically because it demonstrates that logic no longer holds. If Ukraine can reach warships at the port Russia specifically chose because it was supposed to be out of range, then the entire Russian Black Sea fleet, wherever it tries to shelter, has to be treated as reachable. That is a strategic problem for Russian naval planners that goes well beyond the 4 ships damaged on any single night. Now, here's where it's important to be honest about the limits of what we actually know, rather than smoothing over the uncertainty the way some coverage does. Independent counts of these strikes vary. Malin's 44, the Unmanned Systems Forces 174, the Toshnai database's 492, over a longer window. And that's not because anyone is lying. It's because different organizations are tracking different time windows, different categories of targets, and using different verification thresholds. Some strikes are confirmed by satellite imagery and geolocated video. Others rest primarily on Ukrainian military statements that have not been independently verified by outside analysts. Where that distinction matters in this script, we're going to keep flagging it because a responsible accounting of this war means not collapsing claimed and confirmed into the same category. What is independently verifiable, though, is the pattern of degradation in Russia's ability to protect its own airspace, and that pattern connects directly to something else happening in this war right now, Russia's own missile shortage on the defensive side. According to CNN's reporting, Ukraine has faced a serious depletion of its own interceptor missiles used to shoot down incoming Russian ballistic and cruise missiles, and Russia has been exploiting that gap. President Zelensky told CNN that Ukraine currently has 2.5 times fewer interceptors than it had in 2025. While Russia now fields roughly twice the number of ballistic missiles it had before. Zelensky described spending his days making what he called millions of phone calls, negotiating with allies for more interceptor supplies. Separately, Zelensky has said publicly that if the United States sold Ukraine even 10% of its Patriot missile supply, Ukraine could, in his words, destroy all the Russians' ballistic missiles. If the U.S. sold just 5%, he said, Ukraine could get through the winter and save lives. At 10%, he claimed Ukraine could effectively neutralize Russia's ballistic missile threat outright. That is Zelensky's own claim, reported by the Kyiv Independent, and it has not been independently verified or endorsed by U.S. or NATO military analysts, so it should be treated as a stated political and military ambition rather than a confirmed capability. This interceptor shortage cuts both ways, though, and it's part of why the Gelendzhik strike matters more than it might first appear. With its own air defense stockpiles under strain, Russia has increasingly repurposed systems like the S-400, designed to intercept incoming threats, into offensive launch platforms firing at Ukrainian cities. That is precisely what the Gelendzhik battery had done hours before it was destroyed. So every S-400, book, Pantsir or S-300 radar that Ukraine takes off the board near the front or inside Russian territory is not just weakening Russia's defensive umbrella. In some cases, as with Gelendzhik, it's also removing a system that had just been used offensively against Ukrainian civilians. 4 days after the Gelendzhik strike, the campaign against Russian air defense converged with an entirely separate axis of this war, the fight for control of the Black Sea, in an operation that Ukrainian officials themselves described as unusual in scale and coordination. On the night of August 12, 2026, Ukraine's defense forces struck the Russian naval base at Novorossiysk in the same Krasnodar Krai region as Gelendzhik, in what Ukraine's general staff called a joint operation involving multiple branches of its military. President Zelensky called it a unique operation and described Novorossiysk as the last major stronghold of Russia's Black Sea fleet, a description that carries real weight because Novorossiysk only became that stronghold after Ukrainian strikes and naval drones had already driven much of the Russian fleet out of its previous home port at Sevastopol in occupied Crimea. In other words, this was Russia's fallback position, the port it retreated to specifically because it was supposed to be safer. On the night of August 12th, it wasn't. According to Ukraine's general staff, 4 Russian warships sustained damage of varying degrees in the strike. 2 Project 11-356 frigates, the Admiral Makarov and the Admiral Essen, both known as key carriers of caliber cruise missiles, the same missile type Russia has repeatedly used to strike Ukrainian cities. A Project 21631 small missile ship called the Boyan M, itself capable of launching up to 8 Kaliber or Onyx cruise missiles, and a Project 2160 patrol ship, the Vasily Baikov. Ukraine's security service, the SBU, separately confirmed hits on 3 of those 4 vessels, the Makarov, the Essen, and the Vasily Baikov, and said the operation also struck a 30 N6E radar system, which forms part of a Russian S-300 air defense battery protecting the base, along with a mobile firing group and infrastructure across several piers at the port. That detail ties the Novorossiysk operation directly back into the broader air defense campaign we've been describing throughout this script. Even a strike primarily aimed at warships still, as a matter of course, targeted the radar and missile systems meant to protect them. Satellite imagery released by the commercial imaging company Vantor and analyzed by open-source researchers, including George Barrows, showed extensive damage across the Novorossiysk facility following the attack. According to reporting from the outlet Militarny, citing the Ukrainian monitoring group Exilenova Plus, analysts identified a strike near the Admiral Makarov's 8-cell vertical launch system, along with structural damage near the ship's radar-equipped superstructure, and separately identified structural damage to the Admiral Essen close to where its own Kaliber missile launchers are mounted. A Project 266M minesweeper and a research vessel used by Russia to support submarine operations and torpedo testing were also reported damaged, along with an unidentified cargo vessel and an Aframax-class oil tanker at the port's oil terminal, where witnesses reported fire, firefighting foam, and an oil spill in the water. It's worth being clear here, though, that Ukraine's own general staff described its initial casualty and damage assessment as preliminary and still being confirmed. And independent satellite analysis cited by the maritime executive noted that, as of the day after the strike, none of the damaged vessels appeared to be visibly on fire or sinking, suggesting the damage, while real and significant, may fall short of some of the more dramatic early claims circulating online. The operation reportedly combined multiple weapon systems at once: domestically produced Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles, jet-powered Palyannitsia missile drones, and Ukrainian naval surface drones, which is likely part of why Zelensky called it unique. Striking a defended naval base with that many different weapon types simultaneously is a harder problem for air defense to solve than a single wave of one weapon type, because each system has a different flight profile, speed, and radar signature that defenders have to track at the same time. The consequences on the ground in Novorossiysk went beyond the naval base itself. According to Reuters, cited by multiple outlets, the strike disabled 2 of Novorossiysk's major grain terminals, and because Russia is the world's largest wheat exporter, that disruption rattled global commodity markets. Chicago wheat futures reportedly rose roughly 3% in the days following the attack. Russian authorities in Novorossiysk declared a state of emergency and cut water service to the city's more than 260,000 residents. Novorossiysk's regional governor claimed that falling drone debris damaged a residential area during the attack, killing one 8-year-old child and injuring other civilians, a claim reported by Russian sources and relayed by international outlets, but one that has not been independently confirmed by outside investigators, so it should be treated as an unverified Russian government claim rather than an established fact, in keeping with the honest standard we're trying to hold throughout this script. There's another detail worth including here because it complicates the picture in an interesting way rather than simplifying it. The Financial Times reported that Ukraine had agreed, following a request from U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance in late July, not to target infrastructure belonging to the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, a facility at Novorossiysk, partly owned by American companies including Chevron and ExxonMobil, nor to target non-Russian vessels that weren't carrying Russian cargo. If accurate, that suggests the August 12th strike, for all its scale, was still constrained by diplomatic considerations involving Western commercial interests operating inside Russian territory. That's a level of nuance that gets lost in a lot of coverage, and it's worth including precisely because it shows this isn't simply Ukraine hits whatever it wants. There are still lines being drawn, apparently at the request of the United States government. Stepping back from Novorossiysk and Gelendzhik specifically, it's worth putting both strikes in the context of where this war stands more broadly in August of 2026, because neither side has stopped hitting the other. Just 3 days after the Novorossiysk operation, Ukraine's general staff reported that Russia has lost 1,462,970 troops in the war since the full-scale invasion began on February 24th, 2022, a figure that included 1,310 casualties in the preceding 24 hours alone. That is Ukraine's own official tally. And it should be treated the way any single-source wartime casualty figure should be treated, as Ukraine's stated claim rather than an independently audited number, since Russia does not publish comparable casualty data, and Western intelligence agencies have offered lower, though still very large, estimates over the course of the war. Russia, for its part, has continued its own long-range strike campaign against Ukrainian cities throughout this period, and it would be dishonest to tell this story as though the destruction has only run in one direction. On the night of May 13th into May 14th, 2026, Russia carried out what Ukrainian officials described as its largest aerial attack of the war to that point, launching 1,567 drones and 56 missiles at targets across the country, according to a statement from President Zelensky. A large share of that barrage targeted the Darnitsky district of Kiev specifically. That single night's attack killed 27 people, 24 of them in Kiev, and injured more than 75 others. And just this week, according to the Kiev Independent's ongoing news coverage, Russian attacks killed at least 8 people and injured 50 more across Ukraine in a single 24-hour period, including a train crew. So while this script has focused on Ukraine's campaign against Russian air defense and naval assets, that campaign exists inside a war where Russian long-range strikes on Ukrainian civilian areas have continued essentially without pause. It's also worth noting that Novorossiysk was not an isolated target that week. The Kiev Independent's ongoing news coverage reported that a Russian oil refinery located more than 6,000 kilometers from Ukraine was reportedly on fire around the same period, alongside a separate strike on a facility linked to the Russian retailer Wildberries, a reminder that Ukraine's long-range strike campaign extends well beyond the Black Sea coast and into Russia's deep interior, targeting the economic infrastructure that helps fund and supply the war, not just military hardware sitting near the front line. None of that changes the core story here, but it does underline that Gelendzhik and Novorossiysk were not standalone events in an otherwise quiet week. They were two visible peaks in a much wider pattern of continuous, distributed pressure that Ukraine has been applying across Russian territory for months. There's also a broader industrial dimension worth mentioning, because it speaks to why Ukraine's air defense degradation strategy exists in the first place. Ukraine's military intelligence has reported that Russia is exceeding its own monthly production targets for key missile types by somewhere between 10 and 20%, according to Ukrainian intelligence assessments reported by the Kiev Independent. If accurate, that means Russia is not just maintaining its long-range strike capability against Ukraine, it's expanding it, even as Ukraine works to dismantle the air defense network protecting Russian territory and Russian forces. That context helps explain why Ukrainian officials describe the campaign against Russian air defense as an urgent, sustained priority rather than a one-off operation. If Russia's offensive missile production keeps climbing, Ukraine's best available counter, short of matching that production itself, is to keep making it harder and harder for Russia to protect the launch sites, command posts, and naval assets that support that missile campaign. So where does that leave the specific claim in the title of this piece, that Ukraine broke Russia's most dangerous defense? Based on everything we've laid out, the most accurate way to state it is this. Ukraine did not eliminate Russia's overall air defense capability, and it would be inaccurate and irresponsible to suggest that Russia's skies are now undefended. Russia still operates a large and geographically distributed air defense network, and the S-400 system as a whole remains active across dozens of other sites in Russia and Russian-controlled territory. What is verifiably true is narrower and, honestly, still remarkable. A specific S-400 position at Gelendzhik, one that had just fired missiles into Ukraine, was destroyed and burned for 3 hours, according to the direct statement of the Ukrainian commander who ordered the strike. That event sits inside a much larger, well-documented pattern. Hundreds of confirmed strikes on Russian air defense infrastructure across more than a year, an estimated 5. $4 billion in losses to that infrastructure in 2026 alone by Ukraine's own accounting. And now, days later, a strike that reached all the way into Russia's last major Black Sea fleet stronghold at Novorossiysk and hit the S-300 radar defending it in the same operation. Individually, none of these events breaks Russia's defensive shield. Together, according to analysts like Tomasz Nagy at Gelendzhik, they represent exactly the kind of accumulated operational pressure that can eventually open real gaps that Ukraine has shown repeatedly it knows how to exploit. Before we close, here's a brief and honest accounting of where this script's facts came from and what remains uncertain. The core anchor event, the destruction of the S-400 position near Gelendzhik on August 8th, comes directly from a statement by Robert Madyar Brovdi, commander of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, as reported by the Kyiv Independent on August 9th, 2026. The broader campaign data comes from several distinct sources that don't always agree on exact numbers. The Toshny database, as analyzed by the Kyiv Independent, Ukraine's own Unmanned Systems Forces statements as reported by United 24 Media, open source analyst Clément Molin's tracking, also via United 24, and Ukraine's General Staff statements on April strike totals. Analysis and framing came from Globsek's Tomasz Nagy and missile expert Fabian Hoffman. The Novorossiysk operation on August 12th is confirmed by Ukraine's General Staff and Security Service, with damage assessment details from satellite imagery firm Vantor, open source analyst George Barros, the Ukrainian monitoring group Exilanova Plus, and reporting from Naval News, Militarny, the Maritime Executive, and Euromaidan Press. The interceptor shortage figures come from President Zelensky's own statements to CNN and the Kyiv Independent. Russian casualty claims from the child's death in Novorossiysk and Ukraine's own troop loss figures against Russia are single-source claims from the respective governments and have not been independently verified. We flagged both explicitly rather than presenting them as settled fact. Where outlets disagreed on strike counts or timelines, we've tried to show the range rather than pick the most dramatic number and present it as consensus. What's genuinely still unresolved, and probably will be for some time, is how much lasting damage the Novorossiysk strike actually did to those 4 warships, and whether Russia can repair and redeploy the S-400 pattern of losses fast enough to offset what Ukraine has been destroying. Neither of those questions has a confirmed answer yet, and anyone telling you they do with total certainty right now is getting ahead of the available evidence. It's also worth acknowledging that this war is not confined to the air and the sea. Even as this air defense campaign has unfolded, ground operations have continued in parallel. In February of 2026, Ukraine launched a local counteroffensive on the southern front, aimed at pushing Russian forces out of parts of the Dnipropetrovsk region and disrupting what Ukrainian military planners believed were Russian preparations for a spring offensive of their own. President Zelensky said in mid-August that Ukraine had liberated 745 square kilometers in the Oleksandrivka sector since January, and claimed Russian losses in that specific sector amounted to at least 9,550 people killed and more than 6,600 wounded. Again, a Ukrainian government figure that has not been independently verified and should be read with that caveat attached, the same way we've treated every single source casualty claim in this script. Meanwhile, conditions for troops on the ground remain difficult. Ukrainian soldiers from at least one brigade have publicly reported shortages of food and water at frontline positions, with unit commanders saying deployments meant to last weeks have stretched to 8 months without rotation. None of that changes the story of what happened at Gelendzhik or Novorossiysk. But it's a useful reminder that the war being fought with drones over the Black Sea and the war being fought in trenches near the front line are the same war, running on the same exhausted resources on both sides. So here's the honest question we're sitting with. Ukraine has spent more than a year quietly degrading the individual pieces of Russia's air defense network, one radar, one launcher, one battery at a time, while Russia keeps producing more missiles than its own targets predicted. Does a strategy of slow, accumulated attrition like this actually change the course of a war this size, or does it mostly just raise the cost for both sides without shifting who ultimately wins? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.